On June 13, Israeli forces launched a strike against key military infrastructure in Iran. Just 8 days later, the United States supported the Israeli action by striking the 3 main nuclear facilities of the Tehran government. And just yesterday, Iran retaliated with strikes on US bases in Qatar and Iraq. The situation in the Middle East is looking extremely tense and dangerous, and we will discuss about that today with our guest, Erwin van Veen. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you for the invite.
Erwin is a senior researcher at Klingendal and will guide us today in understanding the relationship between Iran and the West, in particular between Iran and the European Union. So to start, for the audience, Erwin, do you think the European Union is ready for what is happening in the Middle East?
Well, it defines very much what you mean by ready, but I think the short answer is that for a number of years now, Europe is essentially what I would call an event taker, right? Mm-hmm. So it has no particular influence on the course of events with regards to Iran. And it basically shifted into that role, if you wish, as of, shall we say, 2019, 2020. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about the particulars, but Europe has very little influence or even leverage over Tehran. So the policy making or the the making, right? That's not the EU who's doing it. That's the US, Israel, Iran, and a few other actors.
Yeah, but we are ready for the consequences.
Well, I think the problem with that position of being an event taker is that of most of the actors, certainly compared to the US as sort of the other part of the West, right? Europe is a lot closer to Iran. So if there is any negative fallout from whatever conflict Iran is going to be engaged in, it's us as in Europeans that will be faced with the consequences, whether we're talking about migration, cyber operations, organized crime, terrorism, you name it, regional tensions. The effects are going to hit us way before they hit the US.
Mm-hmm. And that's so interesting because, as you say, Europe is kind of a spectator in these events, and at the same time would bear the most consequences, and I think would profit the most if the situation remains stable. And I think going back a bit, it's important also to understand that the hostility between West and Iran has not always been a given, right? Especially during the 20th century, before the Ayatollahs came to power, during the Pahlavi dynasty, actually the relations were quite good. Of course, everything changed then in 1979. Could you walk us a bit over how the Iranian regime's approach to the West changed over these decades?
Yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, we have to be careful, I think, in painting a black and white contrast between the Pahlavi era and sort of the revolutionary era. If it was only for the fact that, in particular, the UK has a long and checkered colonial style history in Iran, of course, mostly related to Anglo-Iranian, right? The forerunner of British Petroleum today. And is not very much seen in a positive light in Iran, right? And that is as is the US. And that happened already during the Pahlavi era, where you have the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh. I think it was in 1956, if memory serves, which essentially was sort of an improvised CIA MI6 coup. And so this is, I think, the basis of very solid Iranian mistrust of these two countries in particular, right? I wouldn't extend that to the West necessarily. I think that the next big episode is not so much the revolution, the Islamic Revolution in itself, but more what follows, which is the Iran-Iraq War, of course. When Saddam Hussein thinks, this is a great moment to attack my weakened neighbor. They're in the throes of a revolution. Their army is half deserted and weak for the rest. Let's just attack and grab some oil territory and the Shatt al-Arab, the waterway that basically connects Iraq and Iran to the Persian Gulf. And that turned out to be a huge miscalculation, for both sides eventually. But the problem here is that most Western countries, in particular the US, sort of arrayed themselves behind Iraq, right? Yeah. Not behind Iran, yes. With Israel being the noteworthy exception, right? That actually supplied arms to Iran. Not out of any goodwill, but just as Menachem Begin said at the time, I think I wish both sides the best of luck. So basically to to kill two birds with one stone, right? And then, of course, you get the whole almost psychopathic response of the US, of course, to the Iranian revolution, the Islamic revolution, triggered, of course, by the hostage crisis, where it's totally understandable the US got upset about that. But after that, I think the US has been rather unable to see the Iranian government as any other government, basically, right? It's always been sort of viewed through this theocratic ideological lens that somehow would make Tehran a bigger threat or even get them to act irrationally or something like that. So these are all points we can discuss, but I think there is a fairly nuanced view, generally speaking, of the West in Iran, where much of the negativity is related to the United States in particular, and to some extent the United Kingdom, but that's more because of the sort of semi-colonial period. And other parts of the West, let's say most of Western continental Europe, are seen generally in a positive light. And we can make some exceptions for the whole nuclear deal period, which we will get to. Yeah. So that's a long answer to a short question.
And we wanted to point out one more thing, which really emphasizes this change also in the maybe even in the Iranian mindset from the 50s to today. And we read that actually across the Muslim-oriented world, Iran was the second country to recognize the state of Israel in the 1950s, which looking back now seems almost impossible, right?
Yeah, well, we shouldn't forget that the Shah indeed was one of the pillars upon which the already then US-dominated regional order rested, right? Together with Israel, and Egypt played an important role at the time as well. So yes, Iran was sort of maybe not very closely linked, but at least positively related to the United States.
Mm-hmm. And I remember that I know because I was not alive at the moment, that there were flights from Tehran to Tel Aviv at the time of the good relationship between the two countries, and as well an exchange in terms of trade of Iranian oil for Israeli technologies. So I think it's really like to think about it today. It's really impressive. No, it's totally a different era. But I would like to come back to the point that you mentioned about the war between Iran and Iraq of the 80s, because to think about it, it's also a bit, from our perspective, at least interesting to use this word, because the West, in particular the US, went into war with Iraq of Saddam Hussein 23 years later, the outbreak of that war. And but in the 80s, as you said, the US supported Iraq in this war. And you mentioned oil, but I would like you to guide the audience about the reasons, the factors that push the US to support Iraq, because it was a very cruel and with a lot of deaths war.
Well, I think the immediate trigger for that was probably the Islamic Revolution in itself, right? Which was kind of threatening to the US for different reasons. One was sort of the immediate loss of regional sort of geopolitical influence, right? Because the Shah was was more in line with US interest, and Khomeini had made it very clear that he was not. Right, that's the origin basically of the anti-imperial, pro-resistance, anti-Zionism sort of sloganeering that we've come to know from the Islamic Republic ever since. And we should recognize here that the Islamic Revolution was, at least in part, based on sort of, as all revolutions are, on noble principles, right? Of greater solidarity between the people, reducing inequality. And indeed, we see substantial progress, despite the Iran-Iraq war at the very beginning of the Islamic Republic, in things like land ownership, social security, things that make sort of people that are less well off better off, right? And these are real achievements. Now, from the perspective of the US, back to that point again, is of course there was the hostage crisis, immediately a very hyped, hostile, and very dangerous act. If you see some of the movies of the time, I mean, these were people gripped by revolutionary fervor, right? And people get killed in these kind of circumstances. So I think the US was right to be concerned about the welfare of its diplomatic staff, not to mention that this goes against the Vienna Convention, of course, on sort of diplomatic relations between countries. So, and then, of course, there was the other idea that underpinned the Islamic Revolution of spreading basically the revolutionary thought and fervor across the Islamic world, right? Like what other revolutions have also aspired. Look at the French Revolution, we get all the Napoleonic Wars as an indirect consequence, for example. So to contain that threat, I think there is a case to be made for, the support at the time of the Americans for the Saddam Hussein, even though he was, not very nice dictator. But also the 80s are a different period than the 2000s, when finally the Americans invaded Iraq. So Iraq was a different place. Saddam Hussein was also a slightly different person. But that's the short version, I think, of some of the reasons why the US stood behind Saddam Hussein. But the caveat to that is, of course, the Iran-Contra affair, right? That should also play a role. That was more of a footnote.
And I think quite an interesting fact is also that at that time, the Soviet Union, if we're well informed, also supported Iraq. So actually at that time, there was an alignment between the US and the Soviet Union against Iran, also probably as a consequence of the fear of possible expansionist ideals by Iran or by possible expanding of this theocratic ideal, no?
Yes, you could put it like that. And it is certain that the whole notion of what they call strategic loneliness, right, has been applied to Iran by several analysts, was reinforced in that period, right? It doesn't necessarily originate in it. And that comes down to the idea that basically Iran is alone in the world and cannot rely on any of the great powers to come to its assistance. And therefore has to be resilient, resistant, capable of managing its own affairs. And there's a scary paradox with the situation today, right? Because nobody rode to the rescue when Israel basically started a war of aggression against Iran, which we can discuss later on. But Iran was left to its own devices, right? And this will just reinforce the same mindset, basically.
Yeah. And one of the consequences, I would say, of this strategic loneliness is also the effort of the Iranian government to develop nuclear weapons, to be also from a geopolitical perspective able to have a stronger voice and protect indeed its interest, strategic security, but also from a trade perspective. And I said at the beginning, a few days ago, the US strike against the 3 major nuclear facilities in Iran. And I would like you to know, because there is one narrative clearly in the West that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, at least from many of the Western leaders. But you are a researcher, so you can also try to be objective outside the world of politics. So in your opinion, is Iran with a nuclear weapon really a destabilizing factor for the Middle East, or can also provide a balance of power, for example? Because at the moment it's just Israel that has nuclear weapons in the region. So.
Well, let me cut that up in 2 bits. Like, one is to rewind a little bit to go back to essentially the Iran-Iraq war was the birthplace, might we say, of the Iranian military concept that emerged later, which they've called forward defense, right? And it's basically a military strategic concept that wants to keep conflict as far away from the Iranian territory as possible. And of course, this is grounded in the terrible slaughter that took place during the Iran-Iraq war, right? With like into 1 million dying, Scud missiles hitting Tehran, just like Israeli rockets are hitting it today. So, real devastation, right? And the Iranians were like, okay, this never again. Well, unfortunately, they have more of the same today. But that forward defense notion, there are essentially 3 components, right? And I'm mentioning this because the nuclear program is one of them. And I'll fast forward to your question directly afterwards. The second is, of course, the Iranian missile program. And the third is what is called the axis of resistance. So basically the network of armed groups throughout the region that are linked to various degrees to Iran. So then onto the nuclear program. Nuclear weapons are essentially an insurance policy of the last resort, right? You don't go on the offensive with nuclear weapons. You basically use them to deter attacks on your territory. And you say, listen, if you pose an existential threat to me, I have the capability to annihilate you completely. That's the whole point of nuclear weapons. And everything else is basically suicide, right? Especially against states that are also nuclear capable. So in that sense, whether a nuclear-armed Iran, which is for the time being hypothetical because there's no evidence of weaponization of the Iranian nuclear program. Even the CIA came out to that effect a few weeks ago. Depends very much on whether you consider the Iranian government to be a rational, pragmatic actor or an irrational one, right? With maybe ideological objectives that are more important than its own self-preservation. And I think here is where it goes wrong in the analysis, or at least in the subliminal mental context, right? Because if you look at Iranian foreign and security policy over the past decades, it's highly pragmatic, right? It is the first and most important thing is regime survival. And the second, of course, is to expand Iranian influence across relevant regions, the Middle East in particular. But they do this in a very strategic, opportunistic manner, right? There is almost nothing ideological about it. So I think if you marshal the evidence in that regard, you cannot reach the conclusion that there is some crazy regime here that is ready to start, throwing nuclear weapons around. That's total nonsense. Yeah. So in that sense, I think the risk of a nuclear-armed Iran has been overplayed quite substantially. And of course, that serves the agenda of, in this case, Israel and the United States.
I think that's a very interesting point, because if we look at the facts, I would say the Iranian response yesterday, like, it was very proportional. Like, they said that they launched a number of missiles that was exactly corresponding to the number of US bombs. And that was the same proportionate response also to the Israeli attack some months ago. And it looks to me that in the last years, the Iranian approach was not indeed aggressive, if you look at the fact of strikes and initiative military. So do you agree on this aspect, that Iranian is being very cautious, and that are more perhaps on the other side, that there is a bit of this nervousism and proactive, preventive approach?
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, Iran basically uses these... the nuclear program has a latent deterrence value, right? Because it's not weaponized yet, so it has no active value. The other two components of the forward defense notion, so missiles and armed groups, they're basically not, with possible exception of Hezbollah, they're not real military instruments, but more tools for coercive diplomacy initially, right? I mean, the missiles, how they've been used now against Israel, are in a different category, I think. But Iran hasn't used these tools to basically... sort of launch any form of sustained attack on other countries. I mean, it has conducted missile strikes on the Saudis, on the Emiratis, on the Kurdistan region of Iraq. But these have been often one-off, limited in scope, and geared towards the realization of very specific diplomatic purposes. In its responses to Israel, for example, what we saw in 2024 when the Israelis flattened the Iranian embassy in Damascus, right? The Iranians basically responded with a light and sound show, right? And yes, they fired a bunch of drones and missiles, but it was all so well announced, and it was old stuff, and it was basically for show. So that is the same pattern as what we see now with Qatar, right? The attack on the Al Udeid air base, and what we have seen in Iraq with the American base there, the main American base. And there are two reasons. I mean, yes, Iran is cautious. It tends to follow a symmetric tit-for-tat strategy in these kind of responses, just like Hezbollah did for a long time on the northern front with Israel. We can talk about that later. So yes, Iran, I think, tends to react cautiously because it is pragmatic, and also in this particular case, of course, because war with the United States, that could be devastating. That could actually spell the end of the regime if they're not careful. So they also have a very material interest to be cautious.
Yeah. I think this is really incredibly interesting because, while the approach of the West for many decades, the foreign policy approach, was very much influenced by the fear that Iran could develop nuclear weapons. On the other hand, you're saying now that Iran is actually quite a cautious player. So are we mis-strategizing our foreign policy here?
Well, I think here we have to break up the notion of the West and to introduce a little bit more nuance. So I think the Israelis and the Americans have been profoundly concerned about the direct threat that they perceive to result from a nuclear-capable Iran. For the European Union, and in particular the E3 and the External Action Service that led the charge at the time, the main concern with Iran's nuclear program was more the risk of regional nuclear proliferation. So it was less about we see Iran as a threat, the whole missile business and the armed groups were not even on the radar screen in Europe at the moment because it was far away. We didn't consider these groups to be a threat, basically. And the US outlook is different because of Israel, and also because, of course, it has like a dozen military bases in the region with over 30,000 soldiers and some pretty big equipment. So it's much closer in that sense, right? Geographically, Europe is closer. In terms of military exposure, the US is a lot closer. So I think that enabled Europe basically to engage in the run-up to what became the GCPOA, right? Sort of the nuclear deal, on the premise that listen, we don't have to put everything in the same how shall I say, put everything on the negotiation table, right? We don't have to get rid of the missiles, the armed groups, and so on. Let's just talk about the nuclear program, right? And not necessarily from the perspective that Iran cannot have nuclear energy or anything like that. Let's just make sure there is not going to be weaponization, and let's make sure that there is no regional proliferation as a result, because Turkey or Saudi Arabia might follow suit, right? Yeah. And then you multiply the risks, basically, of leakage, of somebody stealing some material, of warheads flying at the wrong moment, that kind of stuff. So that was a very pragmatic perspective on the part of the EU. And it was made possible by two things, I think. One is distance, right? And the fact that the EU considered Iran as a pragmatic foreign policy player, right? So it didn't have these sort of slightly overhyped notions that you see in the US. So that made a big difference.
And you mentioned the nuclear deal, so I want to stay with that for a moment, because I think it is important to get some perspective now in an era where the US applies a military strategy to basically roll back Iran's nuclear ambitions. For a long time, this hasn't been number one option, right? So we know now that Iran already since the 80s has started developing its nuclear program, and then around 2002 this came to light. So the Western powers awoke to this reality, and a very intense then diplomatic and economic campaign followed to make sure that Iran would not be able to develop these nuclear weapons. And then I say that between the US and Iran, but also with some European players involved, managed to close this nuclear deal, which basically was an agreement that Iran would roll back part of its nuclear ambitions and in exchange for sanction relief. Could you walk us through these negotiations, which have then led up to this nuclear deal, and maybe say also a bit about the role of European countries in these negotiations?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think I would rephrase it slightly in the sense that I think the nuclear deal sort of froze the Iranian nuclear program, right? So it didn't. Yes, some of the enriched uranium was transported abroad, so that's a rollback in a sense, but it didn't. It put a temporary freeze essentially on the whole thing with some sunset clauses to expire 5 or 10 years after the signature, which was one of the major elements of criticism from countries like Israel and at the time also Saudi Arabia. But the feeling in the room, I think, from the way I understood it, was that it was the best available, right? And the deal was, of course, you guys freeze what Iranians consider to be a national right, right? Which under the NPT within certain limits is factually correct. Minus some unexplained issues, right? Back to the 90s and the 2000s that still haven't been clarified by now. In exchange for sanctions relief, right? And essentially not just sanctions relief, but reintegration of Iran into the global economy, right? So that the country could prosper and pursue its national development. Now, the realization of that deal took 15 years, basically, right? Because as you correctly say, it was in the sort of the early 2000s that the alarm bell started to sound, essentially, with some undisclosed and strange aspects of Iran's nuclear program. So it went with ups and downs for a couple of years, periods of greater international attention and periods of less international attention. But on the EU side, it was mostly the E3, so Germany, France, and the UK, when it was still a member of the EU. And that basically, together with the External Action Service, led the charge, if you wish. And that was still a period where, because diplomacy was the preferred way forward, and because the EU had a very pragmatic take on Iran and a lot to offer economically in case of such a global reintegration into the global economy, that the EU had both sort of leverage and could helpfully map out, substantiate, and facilitate a process where it had a much more neutral position than either the US or Iran, right? And so under the former High Representative, I forget her name, Ashton, right? Yeah. Catherine Ashton, Baroness Ashton these days. She basically this was one of the highlights of European diplomacy, right? In a sort of just established external action service, and something to be really proud of. And a very fortuitous meeting of circumstances in a sense, but also, the right effort at the right moment with the right capability. So that was all extremely positive, and I think the heyday basically of EU-Iran relations was in 2015 to 2018.
Yeah. And indeed, like one of the key strengths of the European Union in terms of foreign policy and trade, indeed, is the economic power of the European market. But on the other hand, what I found extremely interesting when reading about this plan is that Trump withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and imposed over 1,000 sanctions on Iran. The EU tried to make Iran stays in the agreement, but after 1 year they withdrew, if I'm not mistaken. But what is most interesting to me is that the European Union tried to trade with Iran despite the US sanction, bypassing the US sanction with a trade exchange instrument. But this resulted in just few transactions. Why is that? Because the European Union at the time, even more than now, was one of the leading economic power in the world and one of the biggest markets, but was still not able to trade with Iran outside the US sanctions. So that for me was very interesting to understand.
Yeah. Well, I think from my understanding, at least analytically speaking, that's a very sort of overly positive take on what actually happened, in the sense that the Americans were the only party to quit the nuclear deal, right? So that happened in May 2018. The Iranians then decided to remain in compliance for a whole year, right? Until May 2019, even in the face of all these sanctions that you mentioned and the fact that they were basically blocking the quid pro quo, right? The reintegration into the global economy. And why did they do this? They did it in the hope that Europe would basically step into the void and basically make it possible for Iran to re-engage economically. Instead, what happened is that, of course, nearly all European companies backtracked as quickly as they could, at least those with sort of any kind of interest in the United States because of the extraterritorial effect of US sanctions. And if there was a choice between, the US market, huge, a lot of money to make, and Iran, small market, a very incipient, corrupt, all sorts of other problems, that was an easy choice for economic operators. In the European model, right, they don't necessarily listen to the state. We're not China. And Iran knew this, of course, but, they often played this card like you should have pushed your economic operators to stay, which was not realistic. But the problem is that Europe did not really want to marshal or to spend the political capital of basically going against the US, right? And so this is the point, I think, where we see that the EU is incapable of following a foreign policy with regard to Iran in this specific case, but more generally speaking, not capable of running foreign policy that goes against US interests. Right? And the only exceptions are in the economic domain, right? If they're an extension of the internal market, basically, where the European Commission itself is competent with regards to competition, trade, and these kind of issues. But this is like pure foreign policy, essentially, right? And so you see several initiatives, but there's never followed through in a meaningful way that might satisfy the Iranians, right? They're at the margins of one of the United Nations General Assembly meetings. Macron, for example, I think, launches the idea of setting up a 10 billion credit line for buying Iranian oil, right, through actors or economic entities that have no exposure to the United States. So it's possible. You just get the diplomatic row, of course, with the United States. That's obvious. Then later, very late, it takes the EU a lot of time to set up this Instex mechanism, which is supposed to be sort of some clearinghouse, right, where you can essentially barter, goods for goods with a proper financial, fiscal, and insurance mechanism behind it. But first of all, it takes ages, right? Which you wonder why. And then second, it's limited at some point to humanitarian aid, which is like, that wasn't the point, right? I mean, the point for the Iranians was to be able to do business globally. So it sort of basically misses the point on everything. And then at some point, Europe is like, okay, yeah, well, that's it then, right? And for the Iranians, that's a huge disappointment. And that's basically also the moment, I think, where Europe loses the credibility that was originally based in that mix that I described between viewing Iran pragmatically, having a lot to offer economically, and being able to set up a diplomatic process that actually worked.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And ever since the EU has basically either sided with the US, passively or actively, or just said nothing, right? Or made a nuisance of itself and making it just worse.
You used the word disappointment, and I think probably disappointment on the one hand, of course, as regards the US, that they withdrew from the agreement, but also as regards the EU, because you said there was no political willingness to fight this fight, right? And then we saw that since then, the Iran has increasingly aligned with a more anti-Western geopolitical front, right? So even supplying, for instance, Shahed drones to Russia, also troops and missiles in its fight against Ukraine, but also now aligning more with, for instance, the BRICS nations. Do you see this as a direct consequence of the failed nuclear deal, or are there other strategic factors at play?
Well, I think the immediate objective of the nuclear deal was to basically freeze that nuclear program in Iran, right? I think another objective that was a little bit more behind the scenes was to basically start rebuilding confidence and to set the scene basically for other types of arrangements that might follow, which could have included some regional security measures, right? Look at the Conventional Forces Europe Treaty, for example, as a source of inspiration, or the Helsinki process during the Cold War. And from that, there might be a gradual normalization, not just of diplomatic ties, but more like trade, culture, all the things that normal countries basically who are on friendly terms with each other have. And so this window closed essentially very rapidly, right? And it withheld from Iran, even though it complied with all its obligations, the benefits, right? Which was basically foreign direct investment, economic activity on its soil, more trade, etc. Now, of course, the Iranian economy needs to run, right? And Iran needed all sorts of inputs, partnerships, and so on. So, it's not a surprise that I think afterwards it turns to alternative sources, which include China, basically, for a lot of its oil sales under US sanctions. It includes Russia. Not because the Iranians really like the Russians. They have a very problematic history with the Russians, right? I mean, what is today Azerbaijan was basically conquered by the Russian Empire, or the Tsarist Empire, I should say, from Iran at some point. And this is highly sensitive. And you can see that they don't really trust the Russians either. And today they're very angry with Russia because Russia did absolutely nothing while Iran was being bombarded by the Israelis and the Americans. So yes, Iran turns to alternatives, but it's not like these are now its best partners or pals or anything like that, or that there is some sort of anti-Western authoritarian order or anything like that emerging. No, I mean, Iran had preferences, under some sort of pressure, of course. It arrived at this nuclear deal, and then it had to look for other options afterwards.
Yeah, but from a trade perspective, indeed, Russia probably for Iran was not the plan A, so the best option. But how will be possible for the EU to be an alternative outside the US with the power that the dollar has in the world economy? So do you think it's pragmatically possible, even if the US a very strong leadership, in case, for example, if it would have a stronger leadership and being capable to really be independent strategically, if we do not, in brackets, solve or become more predominant in the global market with the US dollar in terms of competition, do we think it's really possible for the EU to be an alternative?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a complete answer to it, also because I'm not an economist. But I think, this was an important geopolitical window of opportunity, right? I mean, the nuclear deal. So if you want to make a big geopolitical statement that this is important for you and you recognize it as such, then at the least the EU or some EU member states could have done is essentially to pool some resources to task some sort of state-owned bank that has no exposure in the US with organizing payment channels to Iran and basically say, listen, we'll buy your oil up to X million or billion a year, right? I mean, Europe needs oil anyway, so whether it comes from Iran or Russia, who cares? As long as the pricing is in line with global markets. So I think that would have been a really big step. And, the Iranian economy is pretty diversified, but oil is still a really important source of revenue for the government. And that such an arrangement could have been kept up over years, right? I mean, it's not like we don't need oil or something like that. That was one, I think. And then I think I haven't looked behind the scenes of this Instex, but I've never understood why this couldn't be put into operation super quickly and scaled up like really fast.
You bureaucracy.
The major hurdle, of course, would always have remained that European economic operators are free agents, right? They can be regulated, but they cannot be forced in the sense of where they do business. So if they would also always have preferred the US market over the Iranian market for as long as US sanctions are in play. But I would say that if the Europeans, or at least the E3 or some coalition of the willing of EU member states, had said, listen, you're making a bad call here. By quitting the nuclear deal, we're going to set up this arrangement with Iran because we care, and it's in our own interest, frankly speaking. And you'd done that for like 1 or 2 years. Maybe you would have had a completely different set of factors when Biden got to office, and you would have had a real possibility to revive the whole thing, because there would still have been a basis. And now, by the time Biden got to office, there wasn't any basis anymore. But this is a bit speculative, obviously.
And I'd like to switch a bit gears and talk about something we haven't really assessed now during this talk yet, which is another element in this whole conflict, right? And it is the hostility between Israel and Iran. And of course, it's very hard to view that now in view of what happened as an isolated conflict. It's much more of an interconnected one. And since many or several European states are also actively supporting Israel. For instance, we know that Germany, I think, delivers a third of Israel's weapons in imports, but there are also other states which support Israel. Can we really wonder that Tehran is viewing at least some European actors as actively engaging against its interests?
Yes, we can, but then we have to rewind fairly substantially, I think, right? Because the problems that Israel is facing obviously did not start on the 7th of October of 2023, right? Which is when essentially the occupation of the Palestinian territories got intertwined with the axis of resistance, right? And the regional security posture of Iran. It's not that there were no links before, but that this is when really it became a serious issue. So if we do the rewinding, I think the root cause of many of the problems that Israel faces today is, of course, the start of the occupation of the Palestinian territories in 1967. And the fact that the international community has accepted the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948 and accepted the Green Line as basically the international boundary of Israel, it has refused to accept the annexation that took place of the Golan Heights, the Sinai at the time, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And so the Israelis have ever since basically stuck up their middle finger to the international community and said, well, that's great that you think that, but, all these UN Security Council resolutions, advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice, 2004, but also just now, 2024, fuck that. It's ours, and we're going to keep it. Now, they've been more or less open or covert and abrasive or careful about this, but basically what we see since the early 70s is a consistent pattern of Israeli settlement growth and to get as many Palestinians out as possible. And this explains why there are today groups like Hamas, for example, but also the PFLP, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I mean, these groups, they didn't sort of materialize out of thin air. They are expressions of resistance of the Palestinian people against a permanent situation of occupation, which is supposed to be temporary under the Geneva Conventions. So I'm telling you all this whole story because, if the occupation had been undone in time, then there would be no groups for Iran to work with, right? Hamas wouldn't be there and so on, because it would be settled, right? So that's not to say that Iran's sponsorship of these groups through Hezbollah in the main is in any case justified, or that anyone forced Iran to do these kind of things. That's problematic in itself. But, at least half of the equation, I think, must be put on the doorstep of the successive Israeli governments. And I mentioned Hezbollah, but that's sort of the same thing, right? I mean, Hezbollah wasn't created during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, but it was definitely amplified, accelerated, and grew because of that invasion. And in fact, the fact that Israel sought to occupy the southern parts of Lebanon, which are mostly Shia inhabited. So in that sense, Hezbollah in large part, or in significant part, is also a product of Israeli, shall we say, military adventurism that is linked back to the occupation, right? Because why did it invade Lebanon? Because there were PLO guerrillas crossing the border every day, attacking Israeli communities. But why were there PLO guerrillas? Because Israel had occupied the West Bank and so on in 1967, and the PLO had evacuated initially to Jordan and then was forced to quit Jordan and operate from Lebanon. So, these things are intertwined, I think, over periods of decades, essentially. And then Iran appears on the scene. We don't have a date for this, but, let's say somewhere late 2000s, after Hamas had seized control over Gaza in 2006. And it starts building these relations, right, with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In particular, the relation with Hezbollah goes back to the 80s. And then we see an upgrading of that relationship in, let's say, by the mid-2010s or so. And you can tell from this episode in the conflict, 2018 or something like that, then suddenly, sort of the Hamas rockets change from, you light the fuse, you close your eyes and you hope it actually crosses the fence, to something that's much more precise. And that's not something that Hamas did itself, right? That was obviously a transfer of missile technology, probably through Hezbollah, originating in Iran. So why is Iran doing that, right? I mean, nobody's forcing Iran to attack Israel in that way. So that's a question you can put to the Iranians, just as you can ask the Israelis, like, what the hell are you still doing in Gaza, right? And then there are people who say, no, Gaza is not occupied, but that's also patent nonsense, because the criterion for occupation is not actual physical military presence, but control, right? And Israel and Egypt, of course, which bears part of the blame, controls all the borders, the population register, telecoms, etc. So that's a start of an answer to your question, I think.
Yeah, and coming back to the middle fingers to international community, like one aspect that is very interesting, I would say, is to take things outside the political narrative. So we take as a baseline the International Court of Justice and the international law, and this institution claimed that the Russian aggression of Ukraine was breaching international law. But it also claimed that the Israeli war in Gaza is a breach of international law. As European Union, we sanction, and we are sanctioning Iranian entities supporting Russia, but on the other hand, we are supplying weapons to Israel that are also being used in this conflict. First of all, I would like to know, in your opinion, if in this change in geopolitical scenario that is becoming more polarized, do you think these globalistic institutions that have this global spectrum, such as the International Court of Justice, are losing their credibility? Are they applying clear double standards, or do you believe these two realities are different or war?
Well, it depends who we're talking about, right? Yeah. So I think the standards on the basis of which the International Court of Justice, but also the International Criminal Court operate, they're crystal clear. They're valid, and they haven't lost any legitimacy. They do have lost effectiveness. And that is not because of how these courts operate, but how many, in this case, members of the United Nations have chosen to implement the different forms of soft and hard law that manifest basically, or apply these rules to individual cases, such as the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. And there we get into very tricky waters because, to make a long story short, I think it is becoming clearer and clearer to the rest of the world that international laws and standards in the European and American view and Israeli view are for others, right? And not meant for Israel. And I'm saying this because I think, the record of Israeli transgression of international law before 7th of October could already fill a library. But after the 7th of October, we could fill several, right? And this is not in any way to justify the attack that Hamas undertook on the 7th of October, because insofar as it killed non-combatants, right, Israeli citizens, it is as guilty of war crimes as Israel's subsequent military operation in Gaza. But I think what became a lot worse is, I think, that we've seen Israel essentially combine tactics that are war crimes in themselves. I'm talking here about starvation tactics, forced displacement, collective punishment, mass killing of civilians, i.e. non-combatants, on a scale that is vastly different from most things that we've seen and are seeing at the moment, right? With the exception of Sudan, which is an even greater tragedy, but out of the headlines. And the problem here is, I think, that where many European countries, including, for example, the president of the European Commission, rightly condemned Russia's invasion of the Ukraine as an intolerable act of aggression, right? There hasn't been similar sound bites with respect to, for example, the war crimes that have taken place in Gaza, right? But certainly not with this recent Israeli attack on Iran, which was also an unprovoked war of aggression, right? Iran did not have and does not have nuclear weapons. There was no imminent and overwhelming military threat, which is the only reason or the only cause for invoking self-defense as per the UN Charter. So the level of, and I can say Western here, but it's a bit general, but duplicity, I think, has brought us to a point where, it is really causing massive long-term damage, I think, to the way particular parts of the West are perceived in the rest of the world. And it sets very dangerous precedents for how future conflicts may unfold. Because now it is the US and Israel that are benefiting from the fact that they can basically operate on a rules-free basis. And countries like Germany and the Netherlands, for that matter, but also the UK, who can for now get away with aiding and abetting a country that has basically violated every rule in the book, right? I'm talking about Israel, of course. But this will not always be the case, right? And in future conflicts, there will be no breaks anymore. Right, there will be, and if you will protest against that, they will point to Gaza.
Yeah. But here, I know it's a very difficult question, but I'm deeply interested about that. What is the leverage that Israel has on the West? So on the US, is it just geopolitical, strategic interest, or in your opinion, there is something else, maybe economical, trade, technology? Because it seems that also from a public consensus, public debate, both on the EU and the US side, there is the need to defend Israel, even if it's backfiring heavily on public opinion. So why is it so difficult for the West to disalign from Israel?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And the answer depends a little bit on which country we're talking about, right? So if we keep this closely to home, then, I mean, the main, how shall I say, problem is probably the right word, is Germany, of course. I mean, it carries the memory and the guilt of the Holocaust, right, with itself. And it basically has turned that into unconditional support for Israel, where you cannot even blame Israel for anything, even though the evidence that it's transgressing against international law is piling up left, right, and center, right? And we saw the German foreign minister recently, I think, when they discussed, the report in Article 2 of the association agreement, say Israel is a democratic state, right? But that is not correct. Israel is a democratic state for its Jewish inhabitants, right? It accepted a law in 2018 called the nation state law, that basically say this is a country for Jews and everybody else is second, right? And this is also what it said in the Likud party chapter. Basically, it says from 1977, so way before Hamas even existed. It says from the river to the sea, right? This land will be Jewish, and we have a claim to this land. It's ours. So I think there is a lot going on here. I think, especially on the German side, that basically transposes the guilt for one historical or grave misdemeanor, right? The slaughter of the Jews in the concentration camps, to sort of justify a behavior by those same, well, not the same, because most of them aren't even descendants, but by sort of the representatives or the imagined representatives of these Israeli Jews to commit slaughter today towards the Palestinians, as if one evil can be a justification for another one. Now, that's just Germany. So there are different problems in the Netherlands, in the UK, with smaller sort of Holocaust-related components and larger components that are related to, for example, evangelical Christian links, but also, the anti-Islam populism that we've seen over the past 20 years. And frankly, some elements of, well, you cannot really call it racism because the Jews and Arabs both are Semitic people, so that notion doesn't really fly, but like very serious discrimination, right? Like the Palestinians are Muslims, we don't like Muslims, and the lives basically don't matter. That's what it comes down to, I think.
You mentioned that Germany is kind of carrying also to a certain degree Europe's approach to the whole Middle East conflict. Now we know that it's very hard for the European Union to develop a foreign policy approach, right? Because there's a requirement of unanimity. So there's always the need for all 27 member states to agree on a certain foreign policy line. Now, when you observe different member states, are there significant differences in interest, significant differences in positions as regards the Middle East? And do you think that the European Union even has at least a coordinating role to play, or is it really a side actor in all of this?
Well, that's a really nice question. I mean, we'd have to break it down by topic, I think, right? Like Iran, Israel, Turkey, the Gulf states, and then take stock of the range of member state opinion. But I think generally what we can say is that usually there is quite a wide spread of member state interests and objectives, but the saving grace is usually that the intensity of these preferences is not the same, right? So there are, generally speaking, on each of these foreign policy files, only a couple of member states that really care, right? And if they can agree to a course of action that is basically not falling outside of the red lines of those countries that are less interested, they have a fair bit of room for maneuver, right? Especially if the leadership of, let's say, the Commission and the External Action Service, is facilitating that process. Now, in a case like Israel, that's of course not the case, because, there is a very strong vested interest and very tight and very red lines, right? And I don't mean to blame Germany, only Germany. I mean, I think, the Netherlands, the UK, but also Hungary and a number of other countries are equally guilty of aiding and abetting Israel in its, basically rampage in Gaza. So, but we do need to reflect on these things, and the fact that Europe is basically, in this particular case, standing simply on the wrong side of history.
And talking about, now we discuss on Israel and the violation of international law and human rights, but I would like to come back to the point of on Iran, because I mean the episode is still on the EU-Iran relation, and I was also interested on the approach that the EU had on Iran on human rights as well, because in 2022, there was all the protest after the killing of Masha Amini. 500 people were killed, children, minors, as well of around 20,000 people arrested. And then the repression became even stronger. Last year, around 975 people were executed, and this year it's increasing the number. the EU one, I do understand, like pragmatically in terms of trade, approaching an international relation and diplomacy with a country, but do you think the EU also stress the human rights importance in its relationship with the Tehran government in the last decades?
Well, yes. I mean, yes and no. I mean, it depends what you want to achieve ultimately, right? I mean, I think if the so we need to look at the objective of the European strategy towards Iran, if such a thing exists at the moment. If you want to have a nuclear deal, or if you want to resolve big geopolitical issues like that, one concession that you may make is to tone it down a little bit on the domestic affairs of another country, right? I'm not saying that is, Iran has a pretty nasty regime if it comes to the civic rights track record and the level of repression. I'm not at all saying that's a good thing, but if you start commenting on things like that, but also the disputed islands in the Gulf, for example, that between Iran and the Emirates, or these sort of things, and at the same time you want to catch a big geopolitical fish, I think you have to make choices, right? In addition, it's very difficult, of course, and quite risky to support, for example, human rights organizations directly in an authoritarian context, right? You cannot really do that. You put, first of all, the people at risk who are at the receiving end of your money, if it would even make it to Iran, right? Because there are controls in place. What you might do if the relation is good enough is to get, international human rights organizations that aren't necessarily called human rights organizations, to operate in Iran and work with local partners. And of course, they'll be under intelligence supervision and that sort of thing. And hope that, that creates a little bit more, room for discussion. But it's a very tricky business. I think in this particular case, paradoxically, what the EU could have done and what it can do most effectively is to get that economic flow going with Iran, right? Like FDI, trade, that will open a society like nothing else, right? It will create windows that will grow bigger with time, as long as you don't threaten the vested interest of the regime as an external actor. But that will happen as a result of internal transformation. It won't be quick, right? I mean, we're not talking about this slightly idiotic notion of regime change, like within weeks, months, or a year, but that could have made a difference. And the alternative that you have, if that's too grand of a strategy, is basically to support Iranian organizations in the diaspora who care about human rights and that kind of advocacy, in the hope that they have discrete channels to Iran, because they know how to operate, right? I mean, they can do it much better than we can. You just have to be careful with that, because there are significant elements of the diaspora that have absolutely no credibility in Iran, right? I'm talking specifically about the son of the Shah, right? And also things like the MEC, right? That gets a podium in the US, famous people come there to speak and that sort of thing. But these are viewed as terrorists in Iran, right? So there is absolutely no way they will ever be part of some sort of transition government or opposition or anything like that.
Yeah. So do you think the US and Israel, with their actions now of, I would say, they call it like self-security, proactive rights and sanctions, are we not risking to have the reverse effect? So to make the regime stronger in terms of internal consensus? And do you think the recent events made the Iranian regime stronger in terms of population support? Or as is being said in Western media, in reality is close to topple that you consider as not a possibility. But I would like to know if, in your opinion, the public opinion is shifting more towards supporting the Iranian government in light of recent events, or not?
Well, we have to take a few fundamental factors into account, I think, before answering that question very concretely. One is that there is no effective opposition in Iran, right? As you might expect in an authoritarian country that doesn't hesitate to repress whatever it doesn't like. So whatever exists is fragmented and in the periphery, basically, of the country. But it's not in an organized form that could carry any form of organized political pressure, let alone militant, violence or anything like that. Secondly, I mean, this is a well-rooted state with a capable bureaucracy and very capable security forces that have so far stayed completely loyal to the regime, right? In fact, they are the regime to an extent, if you talk about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. We haven't seen any fissures, right? Not even in the regime itself, despite all the sidelining of reformists and pragmatists over the past few years. So I think it's a bit fanciful to talk about regime change under these kind of circumstances. And we shouldn't forget that the government of Iran, the regime of Iran, still has a constituency among its population, right? And it's not small. It's not the majority, but, I don't know exactly what we're talking about. Let's assume 20, 30% of the population or so. I mean, this is not the stuff of, some sort of Kurdish and Baloch freedom fighters rising up at the periphery and jumping in their Toyotas and driving to Tehran. I think this is like a totally nonsensical idea that the Israelis seem to spin, right? Because that was their hope, of course, that Iran would implode and it would become a kind of Syria or Lebanon. That would be a great scenario for Israel. But it's very unlikely. Yeah.
And you mentioned before that in your view, a better option would have been to seek economic cooperation, and this is kind of a philosophy also applied for a long time to economic relations or foreign relations to China. No, it was a bit the idea to say economic vicinity comes with better relations. It didn't really work for China, I would say. So what do you think would be the factors deciding whether such a strategy could be successfully employed or not?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good challenge, I think. I mean, it depends what you want to achieve, right? Because the assumption with China was that it would turn into a liberal democracy, basically, that cherishes a market economy. That was slightly enthusiastic, I think.
Really ambitious.
Right? And I mean, that trajectory has ended, so we don't know how it would have gone. But I think the capabilities of the Chinese state basically to sort of shape social transformation and economic transformation in a way that suits the interest of the government has turned out to be impressively strong, right? So I think in the case of Iran, it would depend on what you want to achieve, right? I mean, I think the idea that sort of that kind of economic logic would have led to fundamentally different kind of government would be misplaced. What you might have gotten is a government in the same sort of Islamic revolutionary style that was just a bit more relaxed about everything, right? Precisely what you see happening now, because now the result, it's a result of sort of security threats and pressure, but they're not enforcing all these hijab regulations anymore at the moment, right? And why is that? Because they don't want domestic protest on top of Israeli airstrikes and the threat of war with the United States and whatever else is going on. So they've basically considered that now a national security issue. Yeah. And it's not because they don't care anymore about Islamic dress codes. No, they care just a lot more about coming out intact. Yeah. And I think you could apply the inverse logic from that kind of economic reasoning, right? If the pie is growing and everybody can get a bigger slice of the pie, let's just take it, and let's be a little bit more sort of open-minded, and we get more foreigners visiting, we get more tourists. You know how that goes, right? I mean, so it depends on what you expect to achieve with it. And the case of China was, I think, with the benefit of hindsight, extremely naive and ambitious in terms of what might come to pass.
Yeah, and I believe in the last 30 years, like in the West, we have been overly ambitious many times in terms of liberal democracy, regime changes. And so, like, do you think we really don't learn the lesson, or is just, I would say, an easy political narrative to push in these situations?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there was this period of sort of the 90s and the early 2000s that we can basically summarize with reference to Fukuyama's end of history kind of thinking, right? So the Soviet Empire has imploded. That was the main ideological and economic alternative system to, American-style capitalism, even though that already ignores that European democracy and capitalism works a little different from, what the Americans have put in place. Anyway, everybody will sort of gravitate towards democracy and liberal market economy because they're presumably superior forms of welfare generation. Now, and that is also the period where you see this whole terminology about fragile states, peace building, state building, the idea that you can come to the rescue of a failed state and sort of impose a certain level of international control and build it from the ground up. Now, that whole idea died in Iraq, I think, right? And Afghanistan probably as well, and a few other places. We can maybe point to Libya to some extent in 2011. And I think historically that was probably always a little enthusiastic, right? It's basically, I think, you can see some echoes in there of the colonial mindset, right? Which is where most European countries come from. Let's face it, and the echoes and traces of that are still visible in their foreign policies, even if they deny it, right? It's just the idea that you can come into another country and then basically unravel and restitch the social fabric, the way an economy works, the way power is exercised. You cannot. You can try, but it won't end well for you.
Yeah.
That's what needs to be sorted out locally. And I think this is where these are processes that you can only basically nudge or maybe steer a little bit, but by positive inducement. And in the case of Iran, it could have been the reconnection to the global economy, for example.
Yeah, and I think this also comes from an understanding of a society, of a country. For example, Iran is extremely interesting because it's extremely diverse. You have Azeri, Afghan, Kurdish, and in particular you have like 4.5 million of Afghan citizens in the country around, and it's the second country in terms of hosting refugees. So if you really don't understand these dynamics, I think it's very difficult for you to try to understand how the regime can move and what can be the next government changes in a country. But coming back on the point of refugees, do you think the European Union is being cautious also because they are worried that a regional escalation would lead a possible inflow again of migrants that is not controlled?
Well, if you're concerned about uncontrolled flows of migrants, you would rather engage in some very heavy preventive diplomacy, right? Which is not something the EU has done. Yeah. So in fact, if sitting on your hands and watching on the sidelines is your way of trying to prevent the risk of some uncontrolled migration flows, I would say look again at your policy, right? But I think here the EU basically lost the plot after the nuclear deal collapsed for all practical intents and purposes, right? And it became clear that the EU was not willing to go head-to-head with the US and invest the necessary political capital to keep the deal alive. Then, of course, you get things like, Iranian supplies to Russia, which were... That was a mistake on the Iranian part. I think because the EU had lost so much credibility in Tehran, I think they underestimated the cost of that action, right? Because that brought Iran to the frontiers of Europe, basically, by facilitating the attack on Ukraine. And then suddenly Iran was no longer, basically, I'm exaggerating, some faraway country in the Middle East, but it was basically on our doorstep because these Shahed drones were, exploding on Ukrainian electricity complexes. And I think that was a fundamental mistake. I mean, and then you get, of course, the European support for Israel, which is viewed in Iran, like we talked about before, as part of an campaign against it. And this is not just about Israel, but also, Dutch and UK naval support against the Houthi, French and UK interception of Iranian missiles during some of these rounds. And, that's all viewed by Iran as the same thing.
Yeah, and here I also have a curiosity since almost the start of the episode. Like, Iran is well prepared for Western sanctions, for Western restrictive measures, and since decades there has been also cases of circumvention of sanctions. And there have been claims by the New York Times that before the strikes of the US, the uranium was actually taken out from the Iranian nuclear facilities. Do you think this is likely that just the uranium went abroad. You also mentioned before that the uranium was also moved outside in some cases from Iran. Do you think it happened also this time, that before the strike the uranium was somewhere else?
Well, I'm in two minds about it, but not in equal measure. So on the one hand, you would be pretty stupid to safeguard your enriched uranium in sites that are known, right, to the rest of the world, basically, and that are sort of the top 3 targets on any enemy bombardment list. So, I mean, how much of an amateur can you be if you allow that to happen, right? So you would expect that the Iranian government has moved this enriched uranium way before the talks with the US even started, the recent round of talks, to some undisclosed facility wherever they have them. So normally I would have said this like 100%, right? Like they're smart guys, of course, the Iranians. On the other hand, the one thing that makes me doubt is they've made so many blunders over the past 2 years against the Israelis, and they've allowed themselves basically to be, shall we say, caught with their pants down, essentially, right, by the recent Israeli strikes. That's just amazing, right? They were completely hoodwinked by this US-Israeli plan to keep the talks going and in the meantime prepare the strikes, because that's what happened, right? After sort of round 3 of the negotiations, the Americans changed their stance from it's okay to enrich uranium domestically for civilian purposes to it's not okay to do that, which was a red line for Iran. So, then the talks became impossible. I don't know exactly when the plans for this concrete strike started, but it was certainly in parallel. And then the Israelis managed to get some of these leading Iranian generals, right? The head of the Quds Force, the head of the army, I think, the aerospace force, at their homes. Like, why the hell were these guys sleeping at their homes if there is a threat of war, right? I mean, the Israelis, the playbook that the Israelis have, how they dealt with Hezbollah. So and the fact that the Mossad was apparently capable of sort of disturbing the Iranian air defenses just before. I mean, I don't have words for that. Like, this conflict was on the horizon. So, that's the only thing that makes me doubt. But in any case, if their enriched uranium is buried to be underneath a couple of 100 kilos or tons of Fordo, then they won't tell us.
Yeah, because I think like in Western media, like sometimes the word is oversimplified, like in the sense the US strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, the uranium is not there, nuclear program is ended. I don't think it's that simple. No. So like, I think sometimes there's a bit oversimplification of actions and consequences. Yeah.
I mean, before closing the episode, in view of these kind of escalations over the last years and the increasing distance, also diplomatic distance between the West and Iran, do you think it's too late to patch up relations and bring Iran back to closer cooperation with Europe?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would be tempted to say in international relations it's never too late, in the sense that, most countries are what they are. They will have to deal with each other now and in the future. So, governments come and go and things can change over time. I think the biggest problem is obviously in the Iran-US relations, because whatever little trust might still have existed in Iran of the US, that's gone now, basically. Like it's so far below zero that I don't see the Iranians engaging in any meaningful negotiations that they actually mean to implement in the near future. I mean, with regards to Europe, I think Iran has some sort of what's the word? They like Europe, right? I'm not quite sure why exactly. Maybe the old continent kind of liking, right? Maybe because Europe still espouses, at least until the destruction of Gaza, a little bit more these values, I think, that we can all aspire to, because they make us better. They make us better humans and better societies. And also, Europe is a more interesting economic player, right? That is much more. It's more aware. It's more regulatory. It's more, it's not such a raw fight for survival as the US. So there's many things to like, from one grand civilization to another kind of logic. But I think that would require a fundamental revision of the EU policy towards Iran, whatever it is at the moment, right? Because at the moment it just seems to echo the US. right? So Israel starts an unprovoked war of aggression, and the German Chancellor, the French President, and the Commission, the President of the European Commission, like echo one after the other, Israel has the right to defend itself against what? Right? So I think you need to go back to the fundamentals and then think about what you actually have to offer. What do you want to offer to Iran, and what do you want in return? And if it's just going to be, another set of threats, like we're going to invoke snapback sanctions or put the Revolutionary Guard Corps on a terrorist list, these are perfectly valid policy choices that just won't do anything for the relation with Iran, right? It will just freeze the whole thing out.
Yeah.
So I think that's the fundamental question at stake, and based on what we have seen recently, there is no appetite to do this.
So if I hear you well, you would advocate for less of a hardball diplomacy and more of a goodwill, back-to-back offering kind of situation.
I suppose, yes, because I think nothing good ultimately comes out of that hard power confrontation that we're seeing unfolding in front of our eyes. And if you want to be very pragmatic about it, Europe as a whole, like the EU, is not capable of playing that game, right? So you have to look for alternative methods that achieve some of the same effects.
Yeah, and now to conclude, like really the last point, we call our podcast Moving Europe, and our idea is to try to move Europe with this podcast from a communication perspective, but we particularly like to ask our guests at the end of the episode, how would they move Europe? In this case, for a European Union that is more capable of being this, as you said, reassuring force, this force that is able to promote peace independently. What would you do yourself, and what can listeners do on their daily-to-daily action to move towards this objective or dream?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I'm a big fan of the EU in the sense that if it didn't exist, it should have been invented yesterday, right? It's been a force for good despite all the criticism and despite all the limitations, of which there are many, but it's a 27 member enterprise to try to come to resolve some collective action problems, basically, that hinder all of us. So as to myself, I do a lot of conflict analysis in the hope that, it helps us to understand better what's going on, because that's a prerequisite for basically getting to policies and actions that, either prevent conflict if you're extremely lucky, or mitigate some of the worst effects of conflict. So I do a fair bit of analysis that we either share or do for different parts of the European Union. So that's what I hope to keep doing, right? With greater impact as time passes by and we gain more experience and some more maturity. For listeners, that's difficult because there are many different groups of listeners, right? That may have different options at their disposal, but on some foreign policy issues, there are always things that you can do at home, right? Like you can support organizations like Amnesty or other human rights organizations. You can try to help refugees from countries who've had to flee war and help them feel welcome in our own societies. You can engage in boycotts of countries you don't like, that you feel, are transgressing international law. So there are always things you can do at the individual level. I think the key is that you try to stay in line with your values as much as possible, and that is a very difficult thing to do. The EU tries to do that too, right? And it's difficult, it's imperfect, it's messy, but still it's worth a try.
Yeah, really, thanks a lot. Amazing episode.
Thanks for both your time and your expertise.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks a lot. Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao.